Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ESRS's first Tailings seminar series for 2021. My name is Diana Solner. I'm part of the Tailings Management Working Group, where I co-develop and co-facilitate a webinar series on behalf of the group. I'm speaking to you today from West Vancouver, which sits on the unceded and traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam First Nations. So our topic today is developing relationships in tailings management, and specifically why is it important to have strong, meaningful relationships. Our webinar series today and the one following up in March is a collaboration between the Tailings Management Working Group and the Indigenous Relations Committee. I will be monitoring the Q&A box for questions to our speakers, which we will present to our speaker after their presentations. The chat box is available for you to speak amongst yourselves. However, I will not be monitoring the chat box. So we started our tailings discussion last year with a 6-part series on the systematic approach to tailings management, where we explored kind of the newer thinking that is coming together in tailings management. If you weren't able to join us with last year's session, it is available for viewing on the CIM Academy. So tailings systems management and systems thinking has been expanding. So traditionally, systems has been thought of as strictly as the tailings dam itself, the pond, supernatant pond, maybe interacting with mine water for dewatering operations and surface waters and reservoirs. But today, what we consider the tailings system has really expanded, both to include the upstream portions of the mining process itself and mineral processing, as well as all the downstream aspects of communities downstream, the receiving environment, and how all these different units will interact with each other, and they all have an implication on tailings. And of course, with a broader understanding of systems, of course, there's a number of other factors and issues that we also have to consider as well. So last year, we actually posed a question to our 200 some odd participants and asked them, so what do we miss or don't really talk about when we talk about tailings systems? And the big one was people. We always seem to forget about people, the importance of people, and the relationships with people. So this year's series really expanded beyond as a continuation of last year's webinar series, and we're looking at this one particular issue quite closely. So to lead this discussion, our moderator today is Lana Eagle. Lana is a respected Aboriginal relations strategist who consults in building Indigenous relationships within the mineral exploration and mining industries. A large part of her work focuses on facilitating partnerships and helping organizations fulfill agreements in order to create economic development strategies and address skills and employment challenges. Her background is in public relations, economic development, wealth management, and banking. Lana is Indigenous and a proud member of the Whitecap Dakota Nation. She sits on the boards of the Association of Mineral Exploration here in BC and Geoscience BC, as well as on the advisory councils of the Centre of Training Excellence in Mining, BCIT's Mineral Exploration and Mining Program, and the BC Indigenous and Investment Council. Lana is also the founder and co-chair of the Gathering Place, held annually here in Vancouver. Our first speaker this afternoon is Matthew Pickard. Matthew is a professional geoscientist with over 20 years experience in environment, safety, and community relations within the mining industry. He has worked on projects from Alberta to Quebec and in the Northwest Territories. Matthew holds an Honours Bachelor of Science and Masters of Business Administration degrees, as well as the designations of Professional Geoscientist, Canadian Registered Safety Professional, and Certified Environmental Practitioner. As Vice President of Environment and Sustainability for Sabina, Matthew is directing the permitting of future mining developments in Nunavut. Welcome, Matthew.
Great, thanks, Diana. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm gonna adjust my mic here so you don't get feedback. So first off, I want to take a moment to thank everyone for attending. I'm going to take some time to walk you through. I'm going to switch my screen over here, and there we go. Oops. Just hold on just a second. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to spend some time talking about community relations, Indigenous relations, government relations, and other interested parties as it ties to our advancement of Back River, and more specifically, we'll talk about the tailings aspects of our project. I've started the presentation with some information about, just generally who we are, where we are located, some information, technical information on the tailings aspects. And then we get onto the engagement aspects of it. So it'll take me about 20 minutes to walk through, and then we'll take questions after the fact. So I just need to get my slide moving. Okay. All right, there we go. Forward-looking statement. You don't need to read that. All right, Sabina Gold and Silver. So Sabina is a Vancouver-based precious metals company. I'm actually based here in Toronto, TSX listed. We've got a lot of experience in the north. Myself, I have worked on northern projects for the majority of my career, whether that be Falconbridge with Raglan, De Beers, advancing Snap Lake, Echaquay, and other projects in the north. Then I moved over to Baffinland Iron Mines, and then subsequently to Sabina. So I've spent most of my career in Canada's north and the majority of it in Nunavut. Sabina acquired Back River in 2009. And since then has brought the project up to over 6 million ounces of measured and indicated gold, with another close to 3 million of inferred resource. It is a fully permitted mine, which means over the last 9 years that I've been with Sabina, we've done a ton of consultation sessions, and all of the permits. We hold about 24 different authorizations for the advancement of the project. And that is the plan moving forward here, is to move into the construction phase in the not so distant future. What you're seeing here is sort of the lay of the land. So we're going to be talking about Nunavut, okay? We can, tailings are tailings. They're similar in nature anywhere in the world you go. The disposal methods or storage methods are different. But for us, we're located over basically in this area of the Kitikmeot region of Nunavut. Yellowknife, which would be the closest major center, is located here. The closest community to the project would be a combination of Kugluktuk and Cambridge Bay. And we have Bathurst Inlet and Bay Chimo, which used to be full functioning communities, but are no longer communities. They hold people during seasonal times. People use them for traditional pursuits, but generally those locations are empty for the majority of the year. It's important to note here that Nunavut is a set of land claims. So different than some other jurisdictions, Nunavut is one of the largest land claims in the world, and broke away from the Northwest Territories in the 90s. The region itself is separated into three primary surface-based organizations, and that would be the Kitikmeot Inuit Association, which is where we are, the Kavalik Inuit Association, which is more central, and then the Kikitani, which would be on the far east side. So this is just an expanded figure of where we are. Northwest Passage is here. If you can see my mouse, Kugluktuk and Cambridge Bay are here. Yellowknife's here. Project location includes a port facility on the Northwest Passage in a place called Bathurst Inlet. This is Bathurst Inlet, a winter road connecting those facilities to the mine site, which is right down here. This is essentially the mine site footprint overlay. This is the layout of the mine as defined during the permitting process. So this is essentially what the maximum construction footprints that we can have. We permitted 4 different open pits and 4 underground operations. So those being the Lama, the Umwelt area, the Echo area, and the Goose Main pit. In the process, we permitted multiple water storage facilities, waste rock facilities, and tailing storage facilities. The browns are the tailing storage facilities. oh, excuse me, that's not quite right. The tailings storage facilities are actually the gray areas, basically using 2 open pits, and I'll show figures about this later. And this large one, which is the key one that we'll be talking about today. This is a surface-based tailings storage facility that was designed to be operated during the initial part of the mine. And it is the one that was the most changed as a result of consultation and engagement with the landowners. One other point on this slide is that you will see this nice line here with a slight gray shade above and white below. Nunavut, as part of the Nunavut agreement, is divided into Crown land and Inuit-owned land. Everything above this line, moving this direction, is Inuit-owned land, thus controlled by the Kitikmeot Inuit Association. Everything below the line is the federal government. We happen to have one of those projects where we split the project area, okay? That is key because this area where this tailings storage facility is now planned is on Crown land, not on Inuit-owned land. And I'll go into the rationale for that in a bit here as we move forward. So a little bit of a zoom in here, just again, some technical information. I don't want to get too technical, but 3 tailings deposition areas, in 2 of them in expired open pits, okay, and then one of them down in the waste rock storage facility. So we plan on using 2 open pits, which are expired, to store tailings long term, along with 1 surface area, which is the tailings storage facility, which is located right here. Okay, this is a surface based with a relatively low level dam, but a dam structure, and then utilizing it for water and tailings for approximately 2 to 3 years, depending on exactly the mine production rates. And then fully capped with PAG and then NPAG rock for long-term storage. So the ultimate closure plan on this is 5 meters of non-acid generating rock to encapsulate it fully. Of course, we're in a permafrost zone. Everything freezes solid. So by using the 5 meters cap, we allow the permafrost to settle in and thus protect it and lock it down long-term. So when I joined the project in 2011, there had been very little consultation done to date. Sabina had basically got to the amount of gold they need to advance the project, which meant my job was to come in to build the relationships and to fully permit the mine. This is our environmental assessment process in a snapshot. Most of the discussions on waste, tailings, and things like that are done during the environmental assessment phase. The environmental assessment phase determines if the activities and the potential impacts are appropriate, and thus, the project proceeds, or the project is not approved based on the design. This was a 5-year process, 5.5 years, as you can tell, between 2012, 2017. This isn't a normal process. Sabina, initially, the recommendation as a result of the environmental assessment, which is completed by a group called the Nunavut Impact Review Board, was that the project should not proceed based on potential effects. We weren't totally in agreement, obviously, with that decision. One of the first things we did was to go back into the communities. Was the first thing. 2 weeks after that decision, I was back in the Kitikmeot region talking to people, talking on the ground, trying to determine if we had missed something and how that sat. But by that point in the project, we had developed so much trust, and so we'd done so much engagement that Sabina actually received over 20 letters of support from every hamlet council. We received letters from elders, we received letters from hunters and trappers organizations, from past employees, from all different types of people in order to get the project reconsidered, and which was the ultimate decision of the federal minister responsible. Going through another process to get the project approved. But that, building those relationships, whether or not it was tailings focus or overall project focus, was key to having that decision overturned essentially and sent back for reconsideration. So when we do consultation, this is going back, like I said, 8 or 9 years for me now. So the first thing we always do is determine who. So, Diana mentioned the whole concept of people. Well, this is how we determine the people we have to talk to. We focused in on the Kitikmeot communities themselves. They're the land users of that area. Although that area isn't traditional, it's still part of their land. Some use that area more often than others. Bathurst Inlet and Bay Chimo would be in close proximity to the project. Other places like Kugaruk, Johaven, and Tloyoak would be a fair distance away. There's not a lot or very little use of the project area. We determine the regional stakeholders. So in this case, the Kitikmeot Inuit Association being the one who runs the surface rights of that area would be the key one. Nunavut Tungnavik Incorporated, which is NTI, which is essentially the motherhood organization for Nunavut Inuit. The government of Northwest Territories, we had some transboundary points, especially with Caribou, and then various First Nations and Métis groups within the Northwest Territories were also included in that list of regional stakeholders. So it's not only Indigenous that we have to engage with. There's obviously government authorities. You have to ensure alignment between all the parties. The government of Nunavut, of course, is up there in various departments. And then overall, there was about 7 different federal departments that needed to be engaged, with the primary ones being those sort of first 4, especially when you're talking tailings, Indigenous and other affairs, environment, climate change, fisheries and oceans, and natural resources all play a part in that process. So when we talk about how we engage, this is again a slide and a design that we came up with many years ago. I don't think it's a surprise to people who do consultation, but we start off essentially with the information and the consultation stages, to start to talk to people, to learn their thoughts, to get information. And then we move down into the participation and the negotiation phase. And this would be the same when it came for tailings. Initially, we didn't learn actually until later in the game that when we got to the participation phase, that the preference, or not even the preference, the requirements of the Inuit Association was no sub-aerial tailings disposal on Inuit-owned lands. The preference of the KIA was that they were completely accepting of subaqueous disposal, so tailings covered with water, preferably with no dam, but tailings covered only with waste rock, and even with the freezing aspects, they were not as supportive of. That was a major change for us, because you saw in my previous figure that the tailing storage facility that was to be covered by waste rock was on Crown land. That's because we moved it. So we actually moved an entire tailings facility to better align with the way that the Inuit wanted the project built. They wanted to ensure that the long-term liability of subaerial tailings was actually not on their land, but instead was on federal land, thus allowing the federal government to have, additional controls and to ensure that any long-term liability was maybe more easily dealt with by the federal government. That was determined essentially in this participation phase, where we started sitting down with maps and going through things with the KIA, going through it with community members, starting to talk in these smaller groups around those aspects. In the end, we get to a negotiation phase. I deem that to be, our impact benefit agreement that's all signed and in place. Not only that, but also all of the agreements that had to be put in place as part of the environmental assessment. So our approach to engagement was just slow and steady. We went into the communities the first time in 2012, and we talked to people. A couple of these images are actually from that first round. We just want to hear what people have to say. We want to bounce ideas off of people. From there, we spun it into specific meetings, smaller groups. We established working groups in the communities that made site visits with us, that we sent down for with extended meetings for half a day to talk about individual areas, individual aspects. We established, radio shows. We had meetings with hunters and trappers organizations, with youth, with elders. Part of the really important thing for us, and a very important thing in a lot of Indigenous communities, but especially in Nunavut, is traditional knowledge studies and land use studies. We spend a lot of time understanding that, and I have a bit more on it, but we want to understand how people have used the land and the resources, and we want to make sure that our project doesn't affect that long term. Our traditional knowledge studies were kind of done in a different way than a lot of other projects. In our case, the Kitikmeot Inuit Association actually led the collection of that data based on what we believed we needed. So we developed a work plan. We paid the KIA to collect the information. Thus, they were the Inuit owners of Inuit information. We don't own it. It's not appropriate for us to own traditional knowledge. And we basically ran this program that gave us a huge amount of information on the various aspects of the project footprint. They were meetings held both in Cambridge Bay and Kugluktuk, and these were done in about 2013 and 2014. We did use other available information, including information out of the Northwest Territories and things like that. But tying it back to traditional knowledge, not just science, and tying it back to preference was a major step forward for us. Now, up to about the end of our permitting, which was somewhere around 2018, we had our water license complete, or very advanced. That's the major permit. We had done a lot of meetings, 250 separate meetings in the north, and attended numerous trade shows. To give you an idea, here's just a general figure, but we had over 60 meetings each in Kugluktuk and Cambridge Bay. Again, slow, steady, becoming more and more focused, identifying target groups, talking to them about those aspects that interest them. These meetings were, very effective, focusing in on areas that were close to us, and then less meetings in areas that were a little farther away and maybe not as closely tied to the project. These were not, also just to note, they were not one-way communications. There's, in an open meeting like some of those images have, there's questions generated, but more importantly, it's when we get people around a table looking at maps and talking about things that we get the really good information, the information that we can really, really use and really action. On top of that, we had a total of about 192 meetings with the federal government as part of the project processing, and including some with the government of Northwest Territories and the government of Nunavut. So these are a tremendous amount of time, money, and resources spent on getting alignment. So specific to tailings, it was a lot of talk about where tailings can go. Is our closure plan acceptable? Do we have to cover it with 3 meters or 5 meters of waste of NPEG rock? Do we need to consider fisheries aspects? Do we need to secure a Schedule 2 on the metal and diamond effluent regs? What do we need to do to get that project advanced? And you have to be sure that everyone stays on the same track. Another big point of de-risking was our impact benefit agreements with the Kitikmeot Inuit Association. So in case of Nunavut, an IBA is required under the Nunavut agreement. It's not optional. It's not a mechanism you can use. It is a mechanism you must use when you're on top of Inuit-owned land. So this was finalized in 2018 and aligned the advancement of the project with the major Inuit benefits. So not only the net smelter revenue, but the shares, which is a portion of the company, employment objectives, contracting objectives, etc. Included in that is a Inuit Environmental Advisory Committee, whose one of their role is to feed in annually on our waste management, including tailings management. And something a bit different in Nunavut, Inuit Kayamaya Tukanit, which I won't say too many times, IQ, plays an important aspect of how Inuit beliefs factor into project development. And so we considered these also in every step of the process, including the impact benefit agreement. So, this is actually the last slide. In summary, early consultation with multiple parties, taking it slow, identifying where the points of discussion are, and then spending the time to come to a resolution is vital to make sure that you've got a good, solid plan that can be accepted by everybody once you're in the environmental assessment stage. The permitting bump that we hit had basically nothing to do with tailings. It had to do with other aspects of the project. And our decisions early to make major project changes, like moving the surface tailings impoundment off of Inuit-owned land, meant that there was just a high degree of alignment right off the bat. And we weren't faced with, nearly the challenges we would have had if we had stuck to the original plan and demanded or pushed hard for those tailings to be located on Inuit-owned land. So with that, I hope that was a quick summary, and I'm happy to take questions later, but I'm going to pass it off to Lana here to carry it forward.
Okay, thank you, Matt, so much for your presentation. I just want to, before I start, acknowledge that I am calling in from Campbell River, which is located in the traditional territory of the Wewe-Kai, the Wewe-Kam, and the Quayaka First Nations. So it's my pleasure to be part of this planning group to bring this all together and for all of you to participate in such a meaningful discussion. So Matt, you have been with Sabina for several years, and it seems to me when listening to you present and in your whole process of engaging with the Inuit people that you have been on a personal journey to better understand how Indigenous people can play such an important role and to give high regard for their values and for what is important to them. You talked about traditional knowledge and preference, the things that you've learned from. So maybe just comment a bit on how you came into this and I guess at what stage you were in sort of your idea of working with Indigenous communities and how you've grown through this whole process in better understanding Indigenous people and their importance in the decision-making role in a project.
Sure. I mean, obviously, I had been exposed to the North. I had done consultation and engagement sessions prior to, but I never really planned out an entire approach for, what's going to be a future mine. And that was sort of what that first sort of, let's call it 6 months, was spent on between myself and one trusted, individual who really came up with the game plan. And it was always focused on just take it slow. We don't need to pound decisions. We just need to keep moving forward. We need to listen to what's being said. And then we need to ensure that we address those concerns. So, doing things like keeping a database of every question asked across those 200 plus meetings was important because we needed to be able to show that we provided answers. We need to make sure we knew what those answers were and that we could, repeat and clarify them in the future. Nobody, especially in Canada's north, nobody knows the land like Inuit do. I mean, in Nunavut, there's so much space. People have gone so far to have traditional lifestyles, but even in as early as the 70s and 60s and 50s, I mean, people were still living completely on the land. It's not rare to find large archaeological sites where, for us, it takes a helicopter, and an hour and a half flight to get to, but that's where they live for extended periods of time. That's how it works. So you take the time to build those relationships, build the trust. Of those meetings, I can tell you, I did about 2/3 of those community meetings, and I did every single one of those government meetings. you get those relationships up there, and you work together to find solutions. Even now, we get messages all the time out of community members who stop by our site, at least our marine laydown area, and check on it for us and do other things. There's still a lot of personal relationships that develop. But yeah, it takes time. It's not something you can do in a year and a half. You will not be successful, in my opinion. You got to take the time.
Well, thank you for saying all of that. Just curious, you talked about time, and I think coming from your perspective and the time that it takes is really good in helping us who may not necessarily understand time other than maybe a Gantt chart of time. It's taken a decade to get to this point. When did you feel that you started to have the trust of the Inuit people in terms of moving forward, in that time period?
Yeah, it depends on the community, to be honest with you. Some of the communities are more traditional than other communities, which meant, they maybe kept us a bit more at arm's reach. The primary communities of Kugluktuk, Cambridge Bay, and then Bathurst and the Bay Chimo, after 3 or 4 years of going up, sort of twice a year, always being available for questions, numerous meals together, sitting around tables with donuts and drinking coffee and talking about things. That's when, you could see that people were comfortable attending. They didn't think of it as a job or as a task. They actually liked it. They sought you out, when you arrived in the community. People would come to the airport and basically say hello and meet us. People would come to our door after we got there to make sure the meeting's still on and what's the plan. So yeah, it takes years, and it's recommended, obviously, that you build those personal relationships, which I think I do. I think we do a good job at it, but don't switch your teams every second trip, and don't lay on the technical information. You have the technical background, but you need to make that understandable to everybody in the room, which is vitally important. And so I felt after a couple of years, we definitely had those relationships, and those have only gotten stronger. As long as we keep living to our word, which is key, we don't lie. We tell the truth from day one, even if it's not the most popular answer. And you keep building them up, for sure.
So we're living in unprecedented times. Everybody's talking about COVID-19. We're living it. Obviously, those donut meetings aren't happening right now because of COVID-19. So how has that impacted? How has COVID-19 impacted the relationship building process through all of this?
Yeah, it basically froze it. So we're lucky, that we already have those relationships, and we are able to reach out to those people we need via phone. We do have an office. John Keogana is my community liaison officer. He's been, he lives in Cambridge Bay. He's been with us now for 9 years. He's happy to pick up the phone and talk to people about these things. But yeah, our mechanisms for engagement have decreased significantly. We're tied up to just using postings within the community and social media postings. We're using information that we give to groups like the Hunters and Trappers organizations that we send out pre-meeting so they can be included in their meeting books. Luckily for us, right now where we are with the project, just basically advancing financing, it's not as much a two-way communication right now because we're not super active. It's a lot more us giving them updates. If it was to be full engagement, if I was trying to permit a project, it would be extremely tough to have that and to get it built up. There was no question in my mind it would cause a challenge. You can enter the communities right now with a 2-week isolation in a southern hub. Otherwise, we are completely blocked from entering the communities. But even with that, nobody wants to see my face up there. They don't want some guy from Toronto walking into their community, even if I have gone through 2 weeks of isolation. So yeah, it takes some creativity to pull that off if you were really active.
Great, thank you. Well, we have some. I haven't opened the questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Diana to ask a couple of the questions that have come through on the Q&A. And then after that, she'll move into the next part of our program. So Matt, we will have you answer a couple of more questions, and then we'll swing back to you towards the end of the webinar.
Great, thanks, Anne.
So one interesting question. The First Nations Major Projects Coalition have a guidance document for major project assessment standards. If you're familiar with this negotiation tool, would you recommend it as a general tool for mines in Canada?
So I'm not actually aware of the document, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't know the date of that document. Generally, no matter what, a lot of these sources are very useful to at least, follow in its entirety, or follow it at least partially. It needs to be considered. Consider all the tools and recommendations, that you have at your disposal when you're looking at your project. Every project is different. So you do need to, in my opinion, consider and customize the way you communicate. Are you able to do it in English? Are you doing it in multiple languages? Are you using more pictorials and images? What's the history of those groups? Have they had challenges on certain aspects that you want to focus on? But unfortunately, I don't know that specific document, so I can't really give too much context.
What were the challenges in achieving understanding, and what tools or techniques were used in the community meetings?
First thing is simultaneous translation. So we deal with basically 3 languages on this project. English, obviously, but then Nunavut or the Kitikmeot region uses both Inuit-Acton and Inuktitut, and it depends on which side of the region you're on. Our presentations were always completed in English on the slide deck, although if we asked and if people preferred, or if the group preferred it to be in one of the languages, we were always prepared to do that. We provided hard copies of the other languages so that people could follow. We had simultaneous translation on every single one of these meetings if we needed it. There was simultaneous translation. It slows things down, but it is the best way to make sure that we've got it covered. Not too much technical jargon, because translations, at least into Inuktitut and Inuit-Acton, don't work well. You need to be slow and steady, and bring that technical jargon down to what people can understand. We used to do things like, when we're trying to explain the size of a tailing storage facility, I used to drive the community first and say, it's the distance between the co-op and the school. And then people could say, oh, okay, I know that distance. I know what you mean. Saying that it's 2.6 kilometers doesn't mean a lot necessarily, but those distances can be super important. I think the other thing too, is really focused in on how, I kind of said this already, but again, how you communicate that. Use images and pictures, be descriptive, works well. We've also used a tremendous amount of video evidence. So if we can have videos of the areas we're talking about, we put those on the screen, people see it. We've taken videos of our way our project interacts with caribou, and how caribou are, a good example, move around our tailing storage facility, or what we anticipate will be the tailing storage facility, things like that. So those are all options.
Last question. How would you set up the staff who will be executing the ongoing operation of your tailings facility and IBAs to maintain the relationships you have, given that there are likely to be issues or changes that arise from what was expected during development and design?
Yeah, so I guess there'll be 3 teams tied to that. So there'll be an operations team that'll take responsibility for the construction and operations of tailings facilities. So any of those 3. Then there'll be an environmental team that will oversee or feed into the operations team on ensuring the environmental compliance and monitoring any potential effect. That's primarily going to be water related and dust related initially. And then from there, it's a communities team, or the community relations team, that would be the ones that would take that information that those 2 produce, and then turn it into something that can be communicated effectively within the communities and to the Inuit Association, and ensure that that we've got all the pieces so that people can be confident in what we're doing. Site tours, we have an annual requirement for the Inuit Environmental Advisory Committee to make site tours, which will include a stop at each of those tailings impoundment areas where they can observe how it's being done, ask questions, and get more information. The idea of that group is that then that helps bring that information back into the communities. We can't bring everybody to our project site, but we can bring those people to our project site and then ask them to, communicate back when they get home, answer questions, that type of thing.
Great. Thank you, Matt. We are going to move on to our next speaker, Chief Terry Teegee. Chief Teegee is the elected regional chief of the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations. Chief Teegee's ancestry is Dakhel, Gitxsan, and Sekani, and is a member of the Takla Nation in central British Columbia. And I apologize if I mispronounced Dakhel. As regional chief, he was an instrumental voice in the development and historic passing of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Chief Teegee's strong leadership, both provincially and nationally, was vital on a number of issues. Selected issues include the Assembly of First Nations Chair of Chiefs Committee on Economic Development, Employment and Training, and Cannabis, co-chair of the Assembly of First Nations National Fisheries Committee, co-chair of the Forestry Subcommittee with the Province of BC, co-chair for the Champions Table with the BC Business Council, the political lead for the First Nations Leadership Council for the Co-Developed Environmental Assessment Act, Bill 51, and he was also the Assembly of First Nations representative on the UN Convention of Biodiversity. Prior to his political career, Chief Teegee held forestry and natural resources roles with the Carrier-Sekani Tribal Council and Takla Nation. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Resources Management, specializing in forestry, and also a Natural Resources Technology diploma. Chief Teegee continues to remain deeply involved in natural resources development. Thank you for joining us, Chief Teegee.
So I noticed ni Lana, Deneza, Sekuza, Skyza in my father's language. Samoygat, Samahanak, Samawigat in my mother's language, Gitxsan. I think I sent some slides over to one of your assistants, Diana, I believe. If you want to put those slides up. Just a little bit more about myself in terms of mining. I do have a degree in natural resource management, and I have also worked in, when I began my professional career as a forester, and I eventually became a registered professional forester. I worked on a mining project for my community, which was known as Chemist North, which was proposed by Northgate Minerals, and certainly had some experience there in that environmental assessment, as well as many other environmental assessments that were being proposed through the Carrier-Sekani Tribal Council, including an oil pipeline and 3-4 natural gas pipelines. So well versed in environmental assessment, and really that was why I became the lead for the First Nations Leadership Council and the amendments made to the Environmental Assessment Act as part of the as a part of the First Nations Leadership Council. So so I think, this is really exciting times here for First Nations in British Columbia, considering that we do have an act here known as Bill 41. It's not only an important time for our First Nations here in British Columbia, but it's also an important time for all First Nations in Canada. Back in 2007, September 13th, 144 states, 4 voted against the declaration, which was Australia, Canada, New Zealand, United States, and there were 11 abstentions. However, by May of 2016, really, I believe it might have been June, when Minister Bennett, the Indigenous Minister for Canada, went to the United Nations. She stated that the current Liberal government would support the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples without qualification. So all other states have now voted in favor of the declaration. So what the declaration is a minimum human rights standards for the survival and dignity of Indigenous people. So really it's a recognition of our Indigenous peoples to uphold our human rights to make decisions for ourselves and to assert our ways of knowing and being within the, well, in this part of the world, the colonial state, and that we have our abilities to make our own decisions. Next slide. So in implementing the declaration through domestic law, which is here in British Columbia, which is known as Bill C-41, really it was the recognition of our human rights, and for far too long in British Columbia, there was different mechanisms, whether the modern treaties or historical treaties, and the Treaty 8 in the northeastern corner of British Columbia, modern treaties, Nisga'a treaties, was that many First Nations were trying to create this relationship with the provincial and federal governments. So in essence, they're self-determining and making sure that their rights are upheld, and doing it through treaties or what is also known as comprehensive CRAs, comprehensive reconciliation agreements. You know, the First Nations were trying to create this space for themselves to be sovereign and to be self-determining. There is a new federal legislative initiative that began back in 2018, I believe it was Bill 262, private members bill that was brought forward by a member of parliament from NDP, Romeo Saganish, and it was to bring into laws the declaration as law federally. It passed the House and several speech from the throne, and ultimately it didn't pass the Senate, so the bill failed. However, here in British Columbia in November of 2019, the bill itself, what was known as Bill C-41, the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, was adopted by the BC Legislative Assembly. It wasn't just the coalition government at the time, the NDP and the Green Party. It was all governments, including conservative and liberal governments, passed the bill unanimously. And right now we're in the middle of implementing the actual declaration. So it's been over a year and 3 months, and we're developing changes to really, I think in our perspective, the machinery that is the legislative government, the provincial government. Next slide. So the Declaration Act, the key things, it's to develop an action plan and report out on the progress there. There's been a recent report that was released in November, actually in December of 2020. Not much to report on in terms of the action plan. It was about a year ago that we actually started and put meat on the bone on this action plan. However, you will know by March we're in the pandemic, and many things stopped during many months of that time. So we're still in the midst of developing and finalizing the action plan. Within the action plan, there's a non-derogation clause to protect and affirm inherent Aboriginal treaty rights and title. It's really there to protect other mechanisms that are already in progress or have been developed by First Nations and arrangements with the provincial government. It's a respect for diversity of Indigenous peoples' rights and territories here in British Columbia. There are certainly many different points of view of arrangements with the provincial government. And we also acknowledge the diversity here in BC. We have approximately 60% of all the Indigenous languages that come out of Canada come from British Columbia. We have 204 First Nations communities, so it's certainly a diverse area in Canada and the world. Certainly a duty to align provincial laws, the alignment of laws with the declaration. This is some really difficult and hard work that we're trying to implement right now. with legislative initiatives and review of existing law, policy, and practice. So this is really the substantial change that we want to see within provincial government laws, is to recognize Indigenous peoples as a lawmaker, and that we do have laws, and try to sort out the legal pluralism, as it were, with the federal and provincial government laws. So trying to line up where we rightfully fit in terms of decision making, especially in regards to natural resource development. It requires province of BC to take all necessary measures, and this is important, especially implementing free, prior, and informed consent. And this is some of the discussions I heard in the presentation, is to have early engagement with our Indigenous peoples on any development. As you well know, Canada, British Columbia is no different. Much of our country, much of our provinces are in the business of resource extraction, and who that affects is Indigenous peoples in our respective territories. And the declaration makes space for consent-based decision making. So this comes back to our Indigenous government, what is known as IGBs, Indigenous governing bodies, and that legal pluralism, that we all come together, as it states in free, prior, and informed consent, is create that space that we can together come together and make a decision on projects. And one of the things that in the experience that I have in terms of the mining project that I was working on was the ability to say no within the environmental assessment process. It was the ability to have all these provisions to say yes, yes, yes. However, there was no ability to say no. And we really needed that in terms of making proper decisions for our peoples. So this is to confirm the need to consult and cooperate, as it states in Article 38 in the Declaration, is to come together and make these decisions together. And the more that we do that, the better it is for predictability and certainty for industry and for government, and ability to make proper decisions. Next slide. So I think, during this global pandemic, I think there's a real, for in our point of view, a reset. Definitely during this global pandemic, we've seen the, I suppose what you can say is that the shortcomings of our society. We've seen racism in terms of our Indigenous peoples, of racialized peoples. We've definitely seen the issue of healthcare and how racism permeates within the healthcare system. We recently had a report called In Plain Sight that demonstrated the racism that many Indigenous peoples and minorities experience in British Columbia. Also, too, is the over incarceration rates, our engagement with the judicial system, the policing system, also the education system, about racism that really is so entrenched within our society. And I think that really needs to be dealt with. And I'm glad to see that this provincial government here in British Columbia will be tabling a racism bill, anti-racism bill here in British Columbia in the next sitting, which is probably the end of March. So consent-based processes. So this is the table that all governments come, including industry, to decide properly, as it states, within free, prior, and informed consent. So one thing about free, prior, and informed consent as a tool in business predictability, and also I believe what you call is certainty, is that we can all come together, make a decision together, and no government holds a veto. So I want to be clear about that. When I spoke up in the legislature when we're passing this bill, myself from the BCAFN, and Cheryl Casimir and Agriculture, Grand Chief Edward John spoke in the legislature, and Grand Chief Stuart Phillip from the Union of BC Industry spoke to the declaration bill C-41. But I was clear that no government holds a veto, and rather we would like to see all decision makers come to the table and make a decision together. So really the application of Indigenous and legal orders, and that's really what I'm speaking to, is we all have different types of laws respective to our Indigenous communities, but we need to understand the legal pluralism, what supersedes each other, and come to a decision there and how we make decisions. Next slide. So the role of rights holders in implementation. So one thing, our responsibility and accountability as Indigenous peoples, we need to make it clear who the Indigenous governing body is. There are many different ways that our people here in British Columbia decide on how we govern ourselves. In my culture, we have a potlatch system. We are held within clans, and I'm from the Wolf clan, the Lakshtibu clan, as we say in our language, and we make decisions together there. And far too often, we have that our own legal pluralism with our chief and council, and also our traditional legal system, if you will, with our traditional governing body. So I think, one of the things that we need to do as Indigenous peoples is to figure that out and make sure that the proper rights holders are making these decisions, and that we as Indigenous peoples make these decisions, and it's clear. Versus being in the past, we were considered just stakeholders in the environmental assessment process, etc. Far too often they put us low on the totem pole, if you will, and just consider us as stakeholders, and we're not. We're not stakeholders. We're decision makers within our respective territories, and that is clearly stated not only with this Declaration Act, but also with many arrangements with treaties, and also within the legal system with the Delgamuukw Stay-Away, also Sparrow decision, and also the real bar, the Chilcotin decision, that they are decision makers within their land and that they are title holders. Next slide. So that really concludes my presentation, and I think it's really important to understand that here in British Columbia, although that we have different arrangements, and there's many varying arrangements, treaties and arrangements, constructive arrangements, as it were, and stated within the Declaration, and also to the diversity of First Nations. We do come together, and we do come to a meeting of minds, and this is the way we ended up agreeing and passing Bill C-41. There is C-15, the federal bill, that is being tabled. Went through first reading in December. We're having discussions about C-15. Much of what we're sharing here from our British Columbia is our perspective and our experience in implementing, and the lessons learned implementing C-41 to the national discussion. So I think in terms of mining and tailings is to have free, prior, and informed consent. And if you're a progressive, then, and I know many industrial companies or those massive companies that have a big stake in our territories are looking at the Declaration and seeing what they can do to implement the Declaration within their policies, within their ways of engaging First Nations. So the change is coming, or if not already here. One thing about with British Columbia is that there is the amendments made to Environmental Assessment Act, which I was very much a part of, is the ability for First Nations having their own environmental assessment. It didn't go as far as they'd like, and that's why we need the alignment of the Environmental Assessment Act to live up to the Declaration, is to create that space for free, prior, and informed consent and make those decisions together with the minister. So we need to get there, and that's the next step as for the alignment of laws within my context of mining or any major projects. So with that, thank you, Lana. Masaicho.
Thank you so much, Terry, for sharing your thoughts with us. Well, they're more than thoughts there. Something that we who are miners should be aware of in terms of how BC is progressing in terms of recognizing the human rights of Indigenous people and how we move forward in the landscape of natural resource development to be inclusive of Indigenous voices. In one of your previous presentations earlier in January, you talked about early engagement, and I would like to maybe get a better understanding of your perspective in terms of what early engagement is from an Indigenous standpoint. And you use the words deep and meaningful. So if I could hear about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Lana. And I think, it is, I can only go back to my experiences with this mining development that was occurring within our community of Takla Nation. And you might have heard of this. It was a proposal, which was called Chemist North, brought forward by Northgate Minerals in 2003, and went through the environmental assessment process and completed it right around when the declaration was passed in 2007. The end result of that EA process was that the mining project couldn't go through because there was no deep consultation, there was no engagement with our First Nations of utilizing a lake as a tailings pond. So that idea was off the table, and the company didn't see a way forward. They wanted to utilize the dam the lake. The lake was known in, I suppose, in the white world as Duncan Lake, but we called the lake Amazay Lake. And Amazay means mother caribou, because when they were comparing Western science and traditional knowledge, was that our traditional holders knew that that's where the caribou were reared, and that's where they brought all the mothers were, and that's why they call it Amazay Lake. And there was, when we went there was graves of our people. There's a lot of CMTs, etc. And none of that deep engagement with our First Nations of hearing our story were involved in the final decision of the environmental assessment. Rather, an outside party came in, quickly engaged the area, and didn't ask questions of our people and our traditional rights holders. So to me, it is for a company to come in and get to know the community. I think Matthew, talked about engagement with the First Nations, with the Inuit in that mining project, and it may require, I see numbers out of there that 50, 60, 70 meetings, and that's what it would require to engage our people and to start asking questions about who we are as Indigenous peoples. What is our mechanism for governance in terms of making decisions? In our case, like I said, it's a potlatch system. We're getting to that place where First Nations are asserting their rightful place. So it's that ability to make the decisions together with all those involved, all levels of government. But in terms of industry coming in is at the earliest, is to talk about the proposal, but also to engage meaningfully and have many meetings, and meeting the trap line holders and those who use the land, and the community, really engaging with the communities. There's many cases that has happened, and it proved to be successful. And what I should say about this project here, it ended up not going ahead. Another company took it over, and they proposed a smaller project, underground mine. They meaningfully engaged our people. They saw an alternative to the mining's tailings pond to utilize one that existed close by. So in the end, they came back to the community, and that required years of engagement. And ultimately, our community and the other two communities agreed to the project.
Mm-hmm. An interesting story, but I think it certainly helps us to better understand where you're coming from, on that kind of statement. I know that it is happening in pockets and areas across Canada where mining companies are endeavoring to work with communities and starting out with early engagement. I mean, we just heard Matt's presentation on the years that it's taken to work with the Inuit to get to where they are today. So when I think of the DRIPA Act, I see that as the relationship between government and government, so government to government, so the provincial government and First Nations government. So where does it fall onto industry to be part of that act? Or do you think that industry is already moving in the right direction? It's one of those test questions.
No.
Not really a test question, but like where does our responsibility as industry come when we think of DRIPA?
So the responsibility on industry, I don't think they're there. It really depends on perhaps maybe your own company policies to follow a declaration and really don't undermine the process of our First Nations making the decision. Far too often in our experience before is that if the company doesn't like the answer in the end of not going ahead, they would try to subvert Indigenous peoples in their decision. And I've seen this happen with other projects. I've been a part of many other major projects such as Northgate pipeline, oil pipeline, diluted bitumen pipeline that was transecting our Indigenous peoples' territory, Coastal Gas Link, liquefied natural gas. So these major pipelines across many territories, linear projects. So, many of those projects in the Environmental Assessment Act were brought forward, but far too often, if in the process they didn't see it like what they've seen in terms of engagement with First Nations, they would go to the provincial or federal government, depending on who is overseeing everything, and try to undermine the process or state that Indigenous peoples aren't participating or being obstructive or what have you. So I think, if industry gets it around their head that, perhaps a progressive and positive way forward is to look at all the articles within the declaration, accept that First Nations are a decision maker and are a legitimate government, and then the further we'll go. I mean, it ultimately, in the end, in a roundabout way, we get to that place in a very difficult way when many First Nations assert their rights within the court system. So they're, Trans Mountain is in the court right now. There are many other instances in minings where there was court cases. So whether it's forestry, mining, etc., is that ultimately we end up taking a very difficult road there, and then everybody's and the relationship is broken, right? So if you're progressive, try to foster that relationship and accept the fact that First Nations have an ability to make decisions.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm very mindful of the time. It's now 2:10. So what I'm going to do is turn it back to Diana, because there probably are a couple of questions that came in over the Q&A, and Matt has rejoined us. So Diana, if you have questions for our participants or for our presenters, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. We do have one question that's circling back to one that went to Matt earlier, and that is again the First Nations Major Projects Coalition guidance. And Chief G, you've been asked if you could provide your opinion on this guidance document, Major Project Assessment Standard, and would you recommend this guidance document as a general tool for mines in Canada?
Yeah, as a start. Actually, I'm original signatory of the Major Projects Coalition when it first began. The purpose of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition was to, and this is a result of years of engagement of understanding engagements with First Nations that are interested in major projects. But the impetus of the Major Projects Coalition was to come together, get like minds together, and create an ability for our First Nations to have skin in the game. So back in those days, there was an offer for First Nations to hold 33% of a pipeline up here in north central British Columbia. But we needed to create that equity. So, going forward, this is part of perhaps the discussions with major projects as mining, pipeline, or even forestry or anything like that, is that First Nations want to be skin in the game, perhaps a whole equity share, 50%, 33%. You know, that's really where we'll gain the you know, the benefits for First Nations. So we've seen that in the United States, that, you know, First Nations do hold ownership 100% of pipelines, of natural gas pipelines, and they have the Southern Ute tribes have a sovereignty fund of $12 billion, and other sovereign funds in the United States, especially with gaming, literally in the billions of dollars. So many tribes down there. Similarly, we're trying to do the same thing here, replicate the same idea here in British Columbia. And that was the impetus of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And this is one of the documents that they created. So yeah, it's a good start. Perhaps it needs to brush up on the fact that the declaration actually exists now here in British Columbia, and perhaps in the near future, the declaration will be law here in Canada.
Excellent. Next question. Will First Nations in Canada be pushing to outlaw the upstream tailings construction method, just like recently happened in Brazil, where they outlawed the upstream tailings construction method? And of course, this particular construction method was involved in the tailings failure in Brazil years ago.
Yeah, that's difficult. That's very technical. That's beyond my scope. But I think, you know, the point being is that with different ideas of construction. So, you know, the issue of here in British Columbia of Site C Dam and the ability for that dam to be upheld is no different than any other dam, I suppose, whether it's tailings or just simply water to create hydroelectric. Is to look and make sure that the ground below doesn't have an ability to breach, because we've seen that here in Mount Polley after years and years of use, and knowing full well that the Mount Polley mine tailings pond was reaching capacity, and the changing environment, and that's the thing, you know, that I think there was a question in there about that was addressed to Matthew about the ability for tailings ponds, especially in light of climate change, and how with that, you know, seeing that permafrost is constantly changing with climate change, and would that, you know, compromise the dam. So I think we really need to be careful if it's a mining dam or hydroelectric dam, is the changing environment and the ability to, you know, for it to breach, because Mount Polley ended up being I think the worst breach in mining history here in British Columbia, and perhaps North America, because that ended up breaching into Quesnel Lake. There's nothing they could do. A lot of the tailings, it's at the bottom of Quesnel Lake. It affects the salmon that drains into the Fraser River system. So that affects all 22 species of salmon. And there was a high volume of copper and heavy metals in the tailings at the bottom of Quesnel Lake, and it certainly had detrimental effects on the Quesnel sockeye. So it's just, I think, you know, what happened in Brazil has already happened here in Mount Polley. So definitely, I think when it comes back to environmental assessment, is that our First Nations need to really review what is being proposed, especially in regards to tailings and how it would affect our Indigenous peoples, and what's at risk. So ultimately, there's several dams in the Carrie-Sakani Tribal Council territory, who I used to represent. Kenny Dam, which is an electric dam that diverted water to the Kitimat Smelter project. You know, so the Site C Dam. So so these are, you know, these are major projects that need to be really reviewed and understood in terms of about the possibility in the future if they may be breached. And when I'm talking about the future, I'm not saying like 2 or 3 years. I'm talking about 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm cognizant of the time, so I will close off questions at this point. And this will conclude our webinar for today. I would like to encourage people to join us in March, where we will do a 3-series session where we will look more closely into how do we develop, create and develop these meaningful relationships with communities and mining professionals. And I'm pleased to be able to confirm that our speakers in our next series is Maylene Moran, Justin Himmelwright, and Catherine Tegelberg. And I will be emailing a registration link to all of you directly in hopes that you will join us then. I'd like to hand this over to Karen, the chair of the Environmental and Social Responsibility Society, for final remarks.
Hello, you can hear me? I just wanted to come on to say thank you so much for taking the time today to present to us your projects and your input on all of the ways that, all of the different ways that we should be engaging and considering how to involve different First Nations in decision making. I think this is a really great start to our series moving forward. And I think, you know, I think there's definitely some leading First Nations out there that are helping everyone else see how it should be done. But there's definitely a lot more work to do within industry. And so this is a really important topic for us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen. And again, a final thank you to our speakers, Chief TJ, Matthew Pickard, and our moderator, Lana Eagle. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, or have a good evening if you're in Europe and South Africa at the moment. And I look forward to greeting you again on March 23rd for the next session in our series. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.